6. Hallam entered the MacIver gallery fully armed with Edinburgh name-drops, and even if required some items of gossip, all intended to relay confidence that he was well known and accepted, though not prominent, initiate in the city's bleary social circuit. A pretty young woman at the reception desk sat engrossed in her computer. The doorbell had rung, but she only glanced at him for a nanosecond before she identified him as a non-threatening non-entity. This was as annoying as, for once, Hallam was trying to be visible and attractive. He approached, casting an eye over the mostly tasteless late Victorian daubings and gold frames, cleared his throat and asked if Gordon was in. Said he was Hallam Poe, a friend of Ian Hamilton. Hamilton's name had been selected because he was a helplessly sociable drunk who forgot names and faces within seconds, so Hallam had no risk of being exposed should Gordon check. Gordon Carter had a small, compact body and a large but moderately handsome face molded into an expression of stoic suffering as he entered from the storeroom at the back. The usual beer and whiskey hangover, Hallam guessed. He put out his hand. Sorry I didn't warn you I was coming. I'm doing the rounds collecting for cancer action. You know Ian Hamilton, don't you? I am afraid I vaguely recall seeing him last night. Gordon's tone was rueful, with a ghost of an American accent. Hallam smiled sympathetically. Gordon sat on the desk and rubbed his face. Sorry about this. So is he one of your donors then? He's been very generous, actually. I don't have any cash on me. That's okay. There are other arrangements if you're interested in giving, that is. I've got a range of leaflets here from standing orders that can directly debit your bank account to legacies should you or a relative wish to bequeath an amount in their will. I can leave them with you if you like. There's no obligation, obviously. Gordon looked up, his bloodshot hazel eyes slowly turning suspicious. Hold on, is this anything to do with my mother? I'm sorry. Hallam felt himself being inspected closely, a deeply unpleasant sensation at the best of times. But his job had trained him to be prepared for relatives who ruthlessly fended off any claims on their prospective inheritance. He counted a second and then put a hand to his mouth, attempting horror. Tell me I haven't barged in at a bad time. Gordon looked at his feet in secret, and the secretary shot Hallam a look of hostile confirmation. I'm sorry, Gordon. This happens sometimes, and it looks awful, I know. Gordon raised his head again. No, it's all right. It happens. My mother might be interested. I'll take your leaflets and talk it over with her when I get the chance. Are you sure? Hallam hesitated, as if about to apologize further, then handed them over. Gordon tucked them into the inside pocket of his linen jacket. I'll study them this evening. Hallam left the gallery in turmoil. Normally he felt what he did in his job was justified by the ends. But this situation left him feeling more sordid than usual, doubly so because he was now crippled by fascination. Death, after all, was the greatest privacy of them all. A mother's death for Hallam was the greatest loss. The promise of Gordon's impending bereavement drew him with dreadful irresistibility. This sudden voyeuristic craving both frightened and excited him. He wanted to see into Gordon's suffering. He wanted to know whether Gordon was sincere. Would he broach the subject of the charity with his mother, or would he jealously guard the family money? Hallam knew that he must see Gordon's mother for himself, and not just for professional reasons. It was a compulsion whose urgency he did not question. He absolutely needed to observe this. Kate and Hallam entered the conveniently close, if tacky, Irish-themed pub, and she bought him a drink. They sat down together on green leather seats and remarked on how the decor annoyed them. But Hallam could sense her nervousness. She was fretting about Alasdair's impending arrival or otherwise. Hallam, you've been with us a good 3 months, and I don't even know where you're from, she said. The Midlands. She wasn't really listening, her eyes scanning the bar in case they'd missed him. University? Yes. Hallam then realized that since she was addressing graduate trainee, she was probably inquiring which university. He rapidly tried to remember which one he had put down on his curriculum vitae. Newcastle, he said. Newcastle's supposed to be fun, isn't it? And what brought you to Edinburgh? Kate focused on the door, on the off chance Alasdair would appear. I got a train out of England. That was the last stop. This was true. Walking out of Waverley Station directly after his exile, Hallam had been immediately seduced by the grey foreignness of the city, so different from the green undulations of Chambly. He had decided to stay, and with his father's check had embarked on a life of almost complete non-association with the world. No job, no friends, no talk, no television. He sought invisibility and found it. For uncounted months, Hallam lived close to his ideal state. He had got thinner. He had grown paler. Kate was faintly irritated, it seemed, by his evasively short answer to what was no more than a polite question. Anyway, they were only having this drink together because he served a purpose. And why this line of work? She was an automatic. But the answer? The money had run out. He had to claim Social Security and thereby began officially to appear. Government training schemes loomed, and Hallam bowed to the inevitable. He had got a job and therefore was introduced to a state agency which had the one virtue of giving him access to tenement keys that opened up most of the city's rooftops. But the job bored him, and he decided that he might as well do something worthwhile during work hours, and so turned to the light. Charity. Huh. I wanted to prey on the old and dying for a good cause. A faint smile. You're good at it, too. That's what worries me. Hallam did not feel like lingering much longer on his motivations. Who is this Alistair, then? He asked. It's all unutterably boring, replied Kate, suddenly ferociously engaged with the conversation. He used to work in the oil industry up in Aberdeen. He was a dive manager on the rigs, quite a senior job, but then ROVs, the little underwater robots, started taking over most of the divers' work, and he left. Rented himself a rundown old Victoria place in Perthshire with redundancy money. He's doing photography now, arty stuff, illustrations. He looks ludicrously precious about it. He won't show me any of his latest work because I dumped him. As if that's some kind of punishment. Typical. Arrogant. So why are you seeing him? Masochism? Curiosity? I'm not sure. That's what you're here for. Kate took a sip of her gin. Hallam glanced up and saw a man with close-cropped, prematurely gray hair and an annoyingly handsome profile, about 35, with a long face, straight nose, blue-gray aquiline eyes, but with a mouth too soft and full to be matchingly cruel. It was a droll mouth. Good for a sneer, too, Hallam suspected. The name Alistair. Hallam recognized him immediately from his observations of Kate's flat. As the logbook would attest, Alistair's average length of coitus from penetration to orgasm was roughly 3 minutes, unless he was drunk, in which case it would sometimes go on interminably. On Sunday mornings he slept in late and usually waited for her to go to the bathroom before he threw aside the sheets and farted, a small gesture of consideration which was, so far as Hallam could see, perhaps the only point in his favor. Alistair spotted Kate, who had not yet seen him. He began weaving his way towards them through the after-work crowd. Hallam thought about notifying Kate of his impending arrival, but he decided against. He sat forward earnestly and fixed Kate's attention. What exactly do you mean by that? Well, Kate began, he's a manipulative behind all his easy-going pose. Alistair came within hearing range. Imagine going out with someone who spent most of their 20s at a dive bell under the North Sea. The athlete's split would be enough for most girls. Hallam couldn't resist glancing up to see the look on Alistair's face as he was standing directly behind her now. She twisted around. Oh, hi, Alistair. This is Hallam, a colleague of mine. Kate blushed. Hallam stood up and shook hands with Alistair, who smiled warmly. Kate tells me you're an artist, said Hallam. Bullcrap, I presume, he replied, somewhat pointedly despite his grin. Kate smiled weakly when Alistair had turned to get drinks and glared at Hallam. You could have warned me. Hallam opened his arms innocently. How was I supposed to know what he looked like? Alistair and Hallam wasted no time in lashing one another with bonhomie. Hallam guessed that his youth made Alistair consider him as falling in the gray area between a sexual threat and an amusing object of contempt. Kate, as a woman, appeared oblivious to it, so Hallam went on the offensive. He craned forward in fascination over every word Alistair uttered and asked probing questions about his photography. Alistair was very vague about his work and still managed to elaborate on it at length. Hallam offered to pass his name on to a friend of his who was researching a landscape photography exhibition in London. This was untrue, of course, but it secured him one of Alistair's business cards. So, Hallam, said Alistair, returning some withering enthusiasm and glancing over at Kate. You're a professional philanthropist, too. I have that privilege. I bet you earn it with Kate as a boss. He certainly does, said Kate, ignoring the dig. Hallam's my star. I'm nurturing him for greater things. She touched Hallam's hair in a big sister manner. Hallam smiled and took a sip of his pint, trying to reconcile his irritation at being patronized with the pitiful thrill of being in physical contact with her. It was now clear to him that he was only here to make Alistair jealous. The big sister act was coded encouragement for Alistair. It told him that nothing was going on between Hallam and her, yet. Hallam reflected upon the perversity of normal people's relationships and swiftly forgave Kate, but only after he had selected a small act of retribution to stir things up. All in her best interests, of course. He brought the conversation round to a recent episode from the dismal TV soap that he knew Kate watched, where an infidelity had been exposed, and he had read about it in a newspaper review. Yes, I did see it, replied Kate to his question, and Hallam immediately detected the tension rise. His hunch was correct. Infidelity was involved in their breakup, or at least a strong suspicion of infidelity. Alistair was playing it completely innocent, but Hallam could almost smell the villainy on him. What about you, Alistair? She asked. I don't watch TV much, said Alistair. Another drink, anyone? Asked Hallam, standing up, but the time he returned to the table looked around. He was pleased to see that they were arguing. Alistair sought to cut it dead when he saw Hallam coming. He received his pint with almost manic relish. "Excellent, Hallam, thank you. So what are you up to this evening?" "Oh, nothing much," smiled Hallam, not taking the hint to leave. He could see Kate, her eyes reckless with drinks. She couldn't take the stuff, glaring at Alasdair's evasions. "We were talking about sexual fidelity, Hallam," she said. "Alasdair here thinks it's overrated." "I did not say that," inserted Alasdair patiently, but Kate then continued, "Well, I figure it's a fairly important gesture of respect, even if the man in question does suffer from a no doubt genetically driven urge to screw different girls. What do you think, Hallam?" Alasdair was silently daring him to play the virtuous card. "Just you dare." Hallam frowned earnestly. This was the first time he had been bullied into an expression of masculine solidarity. He was in a way flattered, because he did not think of himself as a man of such. The word implied sexual experience. "Actually, I don't think sexual fidelity is a virtue in itself. It may suit some people, but I can't see what's intrinsically good about it, and it's not just men who are unfaithful." Hallam supped his pint, and Alasdair sat back, pleasantly surprised, it seemed, that the pressure was being taken off him. Kate didn't say anything at first. She mastered her temper and took a large swig of her drink. "You can't just dismiss fidelity like that. You're just pretending responsibility doesn't exist to suit your own weakness. You can't dismiss the pain of betrayal. Fidelity shouldn't be a restraint. It's a positive choice if the relationship's right." It was clear that she would never understand what Hallam suspected Alasdair and other men felt but rarely expressed, that it was in men's natures to be unfaithful, and it was their duty to protect their partner from this cruel reality. This meant lying, and the guilt had to be stoically borne. As a man, naturally, you had to take it. "You're confusing fidelity with loyalty," said Hallam. "No, I'm not. Why argue something you don't really believe?" "But how do you know I don't believe it?" "I do believe it." At this point, Alasdair, it seemed, felt that he should say something, despite his obvious reluctance to prolong the conversation. Maybe he didn't like the emotion in her voice, the need in it, directed at someone else. "I think," he said carefully, "you do need to aspire to infidelity in relationships, both sides, but in real life people are so often unfaithful that it's probably better seeing it as an ideal. You know, you can say you believe in fidelity, but it's like saying you believe in God. It's a willful suspension into disbelief." Hallam nodded his agreement, although this whole topic was for him purely theoretical, as he had never been in a sexual relationship. This did not, however, prevent him from savoring the irony of taking sides with his enemy against his most cherished subject. This was all a game to him, or so he liked to think. "Oh, come on," she said, and scowled at Alasdair. "What's so ideal and unreachable about not shagging someone when you're in a relationship? That's so cynical." "I'm just saying—" "Oh, bull crap," she said dismissively. "I'm just saying," Alasdair repeated, half smiling in mild embarrassment, "that by observing how things are, that it's a way of accepting you can carry on like that." Alasdair opened his mouth to say something, then decided against it. "So," Hallam said in diplomatic tones. It was his turn to play the rational male. "I take it you believe that infidelity is intolerable in a relationship." "That's right," she said. "And I take it that you've never been unfaithful yourself?" "Oh, yes, I have." "You have," said Hallam in measured tones. This is a development, he thought. He longed to glance at Alasdair, but he decided to suppress it. "As retaliation," she added, somewhat smugly. "And it hurts men much more, especially when you tell them exactly what happened." Hallam sneaked a glance at Alasdair, who seemed to have gone pale, although his face was expressionless. Kate gave Alasdair a smile that contained an impressive level of sadism. "So, Alasdair, in conclusion, having taken this discussion into account, what do you think is more important now, fidelity or loyalty?" Alasdair didn't say anything. The fruit machine played a happy tune. Hallam admired her bravado, even if she wasn't telling the truth about being unfaithful herself from what he knew. Kate and Alasdair stared at each other, and he could see in that silence Alasdair accommodating this blow and accessing the various possibilities. Someone from work? Hallam? Someone from another network of friends? His face flushed. Kate was watching the various hues of his emotions passing over him, and Hallam could tell that she was enjoying this proof, in his pain, of the emotional hold that she still had on him, and all three of them knew as Alasdair's face returned to its normal color, and he formed a smile that he wanted Kate back. "Hallam," said Alasdair, not taking his eyes off Kate, "don't get me wrong, you're a lovely guy, but do you think you could F off?" To Hallam's horror, Kate smiled as if he had said something rather darling and witty, and stared at her drink and gave Hallam an apologetic look from under her eyebrows. It was effectively his dismissal. Hallam left the bar feeling nonchalance. Of course, this outflanking by Alasdair did not matter, as the rules decreed. He was not taking a sexual interest in his subject, he was merely playing. Of course he would like Kate to pay him more attention. That was why he worked so hard at his job, impressing your subject, he told himself. It was still within the letter, if not necessarily the spirit of the rules. Also, not that it was important, of course. He knew Alasdair's address. Hallam's head popped up through the trapdoor, and he swiftly pulled himself up onto the roof. Below him was the top of the tenement's communal staircase. Above him, the neon-polluted night sky. He closed the trap door and put aside the padlock. Gordon Carter's place was just a few streets from Clate's, but a wide road had prevented him from traveling entirely by rooftop. The keys copied from the estate agents had proved their worth again, and Gordon's address had not been difficult to find. It was a well-known party venue. Mentally reviewing the layout of the building, Hallam soon arrived with a soft thud on top of the apartment that he was looking for. Gordon's flat was off close at the lower end of the Royal Mile, and the view of Holyrood Place was very fetching. Construction of the new Scottish Parliament building to the left was also underway, but currently all that could be seen were banks of scaffolding and tarpaulin. Like most single people, Gordon had taken a top flat for the views and lower asking price. Judging by the smell of liver and bacon coming up from the ventilator fan, Hallam was just in time for the end of Gordon's dinner. He heard a chair scrape in the kitchen and footsteps going through into the hallway. A door shut, and he heard a second ventilator starting up, most likely the bathroom. Then up floated the sound of whistling, Elgar's cello concerto, unless he was much mistaken, presumably to the accompaniment of a bowel movement. The toilet flushed, and after a brief phone call to a crony, Gordon was out the door and off to a bar. Hallam waited until he was safely out on the street below. Then he left a few more minutes of caution before crawling to the edge of the roof. He peered down over the stone gable with the aid of a mirror, confirmed that the window had been left open, Lothian-based cat burglars being thin on the ground. Fortunately, the building backed out an old warehouse with a rarely used close running up the side. He was therefore unlikely to be seen. He pulled out a length of thin rope from inside his boiler suit and flipped the noose over the gable's top crenellation. He stepped into his abseiling tackle and clipped the rope through the metal fastener. Then he lowered himself steadily over the edge, hooking his legs into the open window. He twisted under the mullion and landed cleanly on Gordon's polished floorboards. Hallam underwent his standard tour of the new subject's property, getting a feel for the place, assessing his personal touches, flicking through the correspondence. In Gordon's case, the content of the desk drawers indicated the parlous financial state of his gallery and variety of personal debts. In the waste paper basket were Cancer Action's crumpled leaflets. Hallam looked at the telephone on his desk next morning, sipped from the daily iron brew, and took a deep breath. Kate had wandered out of the office to get a coffee, and now was his opportunity. He picked up the receiver and dialed the McIver Galleries. It was the girl who picked up. Hallam asked for Gordon, and on being who asked who was calling, said to tell him that it was Cancer Action again. A pause. Hello? This is Hallam Foe. Gordon from Cancer Action. Do you remember? Yes, I do. His tone was colder. I spoke to my mother and sent her leaflets. It's up to her now, really. Thanks very much. I wasn't actually ringing about that. I just thought I might have an address book there. You've not seen it, have you? No, I'm afraid not. Thanks anyway. Maybe see you around. Sure. Hallam put down the phone. The excuse about the address book was just to guard against any possible accusation of harassment, so Gordon was lying. Hallam was in no position to divine his motives, but it was clear that access to Miss Carter was denied. This was not enough to stop him. His finger dialed another number, lifted from the telephone directory under Strathkeld Lodge, the family residence mentioned in the magazine article. It rang for some time until it was eventually picked up, and a small female voice, echoing what sounded like a vaulted room, answered. Hello, this is Dunkeld, 2452. Hallam cranked up his sunniest voice. Good morning, is that Miss Carter? My name is Hallam Foe. Your son Gordon put me on to you because he thought you might be interested in the charity I work for. In fact, I was round at his flat just the other night. A beautiful set of prints he has on the wall. For his 21st, were they? What a wonderful gift. Early for the appointment, Hallam went up the potholed private road that wound between two mountains. It was a surprisingly bleak view after the lushness of the Perthshire countryside that he had driven through north of Edinburgh. In front of him was Strathkeld Lodge, a former hunting lodge from its appearance, sheltered by a stand of pines on the left and a hill behind. A car was parked outside, presumably that of Miss Carter and a housekeeper. Miss Carter answered the door. Hallam looked hungrily over her face, as closely as politeness would allow. She was a kind-looking woman, despite the puckering around her eyes that arose, he suspected, from long-suffered pain. She had a thin nose, straight, dignified posture, and a discreet wig. She might have seemed intimidatingly grand in her pearls and thick tweed skirt, but Hallam was not put off by that. It was not untypical of the moneyed and dying in this part of the world. He introduced himself and she ushered him in, immediately fussing about him, or at least because she had to be moved slowly and gingerly, giving that impression. Her time in America had not touched her accent any more than her appearance. Hallam had taken through to a cozy sitting room, crammed with carpets and sofas, the fire blazing in the grate despite the close weather outside. She sat down with great caution, talking as she did so to distract attention from her movements. I've spent most of my life in the unlucky position of never having to think about money at all. I say unlucky because ever since my husband died it has been rather fascinating discovering all the ins and outs of the family investments. He did put it into some very strange things once he'd sold his business, tobacco and timber and mining. I wouldn't dream of questioning his ethical decisions, but I must say, I do believe in doing something useful with money if you do have it, don't you? Something that does good? I completely agree. Now I want you to tell me all about your charity. He began to explain the details of the legacy program. He crouched beside her on one knee and guided her through the leaflet, the point of the sharpened pencil. A no-nonsense yellow number, unchewed, which he had selected from several in his pocket. He was pointing out the easy-to-fill-in instructions to the solicitor when he heard the front door open and close. It was all going swimmingly. She seemed bright and perfectly amenable. Another door shut beyond the far wall, near where he assumed the gun room would be. With practiced hands, Hallam flipped over the leaflet and pointed again with his pencil. At this point, he heard the whistling of Elgar's cello concerto. Hallam stood up woodenly and returned to his seat opposite Miss Carter, and she burbled appreciatively. Well, this all sounds wonderfully easy, and it is such a good cause, close to my heart as you can imagine. I feel sure that I will make some arrangements. Hallam smiled wanly as he heard the flush of the toilet cistern. The cello is reaching its crescendo now, just where its melody is swept out by the rest of the orchestra. Gordon's falsetto strained to interpret the deep yearning of the music, and the note broke as he stomped towards the sitting room. In he came, dressed in a thick green corduroys and a frayed brown checkered shirt. He looked unusually healthy. He paused in the doorway and glanced towards Hallam, but only for a moment before he spotted the loaded tray, made straight for the pot of tea. He began pouring. Gordon, look here, don't gobble up all those scones yourself. What about offering some to our guest? Gordon stopped, masticating on his scone, and took a heavy slurp of his tea. Sorry, Mother. Hello there, Hallam. Would you care for another scone? No, thank you, said Hallam. I'm fine. Gordon gave his mother a you-see glance and took another bite. He chewed away, gazing blankly at the coals in the grate. In his country setting, he seemed boyish and content. I hope you don't mind Gordon being here. I thought he should be present since this is a family matter after all. But you think it's a jolly good idea, don't you, dear? Yeah, sure. Miss Carter shifted uncomfortably in her seat, pain running along rivulets around her eyes, and Gordon jumped up. Let me help you there, Mother. He placed another cushion behind her back, and she thanked him. She smiled apologetically to Hallam. My son spoils me rotten, as you can see. I am lucky to have a boy who is prepared to help look after his old mother. It gives Miss MacDonald some much-deserved time off. Gordon went and sat back down, the picture of a concerned and affectionate son, and why shouldn't he be? Perhaps he had been wrong to suspect Gordon of being mercenary, thought Hallam. How could his son not love his mother? He saw the solace that Gordon was providing in his mother's faded smile of gratitude. Hallam looked from one to the other and felt emotion catch him, as usual, unprepared. It was as if impending death could almost be a blessing, a natural bringing together before departure. This was the sort of son that he would have been, he told himself, if he had had the chance, if she had lived long enough for him to prove it to her, if she had given him warning that she was going to go. His rush of self-pity transposed into sudden anger. His eyes stung, his throat tightened, and he stood up briskly. What was he doing? Why was he doing this to himself? Thank you so much for the tea, Miss Carter. I really ought to be going. No, thank you, Mr. Flo. This really is a most wonderful idea. Show your friend out, Gordon. Really, that won't be necessary, but Gordon rose anyway and stood by the door, and Hallam shook hands gently with his mother. It was all he could manage not to cry. He felt a pitiful urge to put his head on her lap and be comforted. Then he thought to himself, what brand of selfishness is this, desiring succor for someone who was on their way to death? She noticed his emotion and smiled. You should be used to this by now. Goodbye, Miss Carter. He was choking. He stood straight and went stiffly out to the violence of Gordon's gaze. He was down the corridor, walking fast, when he heard Gordon say cheerfully, Back soon, Mother, and followed him out. They stepped out the front door, and Hallam made straight for his car, but Gordon grabbed his arm and swung him round. How dare you approach her directly, you effing vulture? And then have the nerve to snivel over her like you care. Hallam pulled himself together. Your mother is obviously a very kind and generous woman. I certainly didn't mean to offend you. But you saw for yourself that she was interested in this charity, and if I had left it to you, she would never have heard about us." "That's not true." Gordon was about to continue with his denial, but he saw the knowledge and contempt in Hallam's face. It made him angrier. "You should appreciate her more," said Hallam with great seriousness. Gordon began to shake. "How can you—" He controlled his voice. "You don't know the first thing about her. Oh, she looks terribly sweet and pitiful now, but she let my father walk all over me. She was a coward. She never loved me. So yes, I want her money, and why not? Why should it go to you?" Hallam shook his head, his worst suspicions confirmed, and got into the car. Gordon bent down, those hazel eyes now angular and full of desperate conviction. "You're no better than me." He was wrong, of course. Hallam felt, with a certain pride, that he was capable of a great deal worse. But he did not reply, only waited to see whether Gordon was going to add anything. Then he shut the door, turned the car swiftly round, and drove away. Gordon stood and watched him until he passed out of sight behind the shadow of the mountain. As it was Friday, Hallam phoned the office and told Kate the encouraging news. She told him to take the rest of the afternoon off. After all, it would be late by the time he got back. She sounded a little cool. Did she want to avoid him? However, it was just the opportunity he needed to take a drive across the country, towards where Alasdair kept his studio. Alasdair Cruikshank. Hallam negotiated the gentle banking corners of the country road, hedgerows skimming by in the pale summer sunshine. He preferred these green rolling hills and the deciduous woodland to the desolate grandeur of the full-blown highlands further north. The human skill helped him think, while the vast northern glens that he had driven through in the past had only filled him with a sense of emptiness. According to habit, Hallam mentally shifted the letters of Alasdair's name into the special superstitious grid he applied to subjects of curiosity to see if they augured well. Alasdair. The first name fitted. 8 letters. This was unusual, though not especially significant. He then applied the surname. 11. 8-11. The time when life had changed all those years ago at the Leicester restaurant. A perfect correlation. Hallam frowned. This augured something, but what? The digits 8 and 11 were indicators of significance in his life, whether he found them in the number of chimney pots or a stack or in a subject's address. They beckoned him towards Alasdair. The peeling sign to Athelford Grange came into sight about half a mile after the end of the grey stone-built market town, which was dominated by an ugly and stuffy-looking hotel. However, he did not follow the sign. Instead, he went back into the town centre and parked outside the tourist information kiosk so as not to attract attention. He pulled off his tie and jacket and wriggled into a brown jersey. Next, he took from the boot of haversack a pair of walking boots and a Gore-Tex wind cheater. Shoving the Leica binoculars into his pocket and a camera on a belt round his waist, he completed the picture. Tourist. He popped into the kiosk and picked up some leaflets on the area, briefly enduring some advice from the friendly lady at the counter. The area was indeed rich in bird life, and no, didn't know that one of the few peacefully coexisting grey and red squirrel communities in Britain was just on their doorstep. How fascinating. Then he drove back out of the village the way he had just come. He parked in a lay-by on a straight and quiet stretch of road and began to make his way up the wooded bank, at first with difficulty because it was steep, but then with greater ease as the fir trees gave way to hillside peppered with rabbit warrens. After a steep climb, Hallam stopped and turned to enjoy the breeze. His opened mouth made it a shell to the wind, softly howling, then took the binoculars and gave the countryside an ostentatious sweep, for the benefit of any locals who might be watching, following for some time the birds that darted low along the banks. He made his way towards the summit, a further 15 minutes' walk up. At the top, the wind buffeted him quite heavily. Eyes watering, he scanned the view below. Various prosperous-looking farms covered the valley, which was flanked on either side by steeper hillsides with their crowns covered in rock and heather. Further to the north, the mountain rose, partly obscured by distant weather systems. Straight down the hill, Hallam saw a thick covering of pines not lined up in geometric patterns like the commercial forest, but growing freely to act as a windbreak for what must be the house beyond. Checking its positions with the road, Hallam concluded that this would be Alasdair's property. Scattering a few sheep, Hallam made his way down, curving away to the right so as to reach cover quickly, away from the valley road. He circled the property from the safety of the abundant hedges and shrubbery. It was built in the local grey stone, patched with lichen, and the front was adorned with 2 self-important Scottish baronial turrets. The short drive down to the road had a small cottage at the electric gate which operated by punching a code into a console on the gatepost. Alasdair, or whoever owned the property, had taken more than the usual amount of care with security for a comfortable rural area like this. Alasdair was home, judging by the Toyota truck parked at the back, although Hallam did not see any movements through the large kitchen windows or any other of the windows. He sat and waited. The phone gave out 3 rings at one point and then stopped, either picked up or taken by an answering machine. It was not until after 7 that another car drew up at the gate off the road. A young blonde woman jumped out and tapped a code on the button console, and the gate whirred open. She got back in the car and made her way slowly up the rutted drive. This is it, he thought with bitter triumph, proof that he's cheating on Kate. The light was still good enough for him to take 5 clear shots of the girl from behind a set of ferns as she got out of the car. Her hair was a mess of curls. She was probably in her mid or late 20s, big-busted with large crocodile handbag over her shoulder. Her face was the kind of perfect proportions that he found difficult to like, but he warmed to her walk, long and relaxed. She wore bright, thick-soled trainers, black jeans, and a tight tracksuit top. He surprised himself by feeling attracted to her and then jealous of Alasdair. Hallam scolded himself for such unworthy thoughts, and then, in an effort to purge them, sought out his reserves of contempt. He imagined that this girl was thick, but convinced of her own intelligence. Perhaps she possessed an unfinished degree in fabric design from one of the new universities. Hallam was snobbish about higher education, even though he had never had any himself. Perhaps at his next CV he would choose Oxford or Cambridge. The girl headed straight to the back door, rang the bell to indicate her arrival, and let herself in. She did not go through to the kitchen, and Hallam was left helplessly guessing what might be going on. He circled to the back of the house, climbed to the bank, keeping well back in the trees. From here he had a good, almost horizontal view of the upper windows. Of the house's foundations were sunk into the hem of the hill. The walls were surrounded by a wide moat of gravel, which Hallam noted with annoyance. It made a silent approach almost impossible. A light suddenly came on in the near window, illuminating a green bedroom. The girl came in and dropped her bag on the bed, thankfully not thinking to draw the curtains in the emptiness of the countryside. Hallam drew the Lancia binoculars to his eyes and brought her into focus. She pulled her shirt over her head without undoing the buttons, revealing a lightly tanned, possibly even goose-pimpled upper body. Then she sat down and took off her trainers and jeans. Was this Alasdair's bedroom? It looked more like a spare room. There were no indications of male occupation. Where was he? When she stood up again, she had her back to the window. She pulled on a thin black negligee. A bit early for bed, wasn't it? Then went across to the mirror and began to apply makeup. This took 17 minutes. She picked up a thin jumper and, throwing it over her shoulders, went out of the room again, turning the light off behind her. Darkness had fallen rapidly in this time, but Hallam only noticed now. He scratched irritably at the midge bites on his neck. They must be occupying an interior room. He would have to risk crossing the loose gravel to access the roof. It was the only way.